Well, Dean, thank you for doing this. I'm thrilled. I've been pouring through your books and have been for quite a while. So I've been really looking forward to having this conversation with you. Um, I want to just start by getting you credentialed. The focus of our conversation is going to be your lifelong work on psychic research or psi research. You can explain more when we get into it what that really means. But I just want to start by kind of credentialing you in terms of your bio. So you are now the chief scientist at the Institute for Noetic Science, associated distinguished professor of integral and transpersonal psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and co-founder and chairman of the genetic neuroengineering company Cognigenetics. Is that how you say it? Cognigenetics?
Cognigenics.
Cognigenics. And you're very technically trained, so in your earlier life, at a BS degree in electrical engineering, magna cum laude, with an honors in physics, which I think is important as we roll into this, from University of Massachusetts Amherst. You got a master's in electrical engineering, master's of science in electrical engineering, PhD in psychology from University of Illinois in Champaign. We have a family business located there. You've spent 4 decades of research in this area of psi phenomenon, which is just fascinating. But prior to all that, or maybe concurrently, I don't really know the timeline. You worked at Bell Labs and GTE Labs doing advanced telecommunication development. Princeton University, University of Edinburgh, SRI International. You were working on the Stargate program, now declassified psychic espionage for the U.S. government. So you've been in this for a while. Authored and co-authored 300 scientific, technical, and popular articles, 4 dozen book chapters, and 9 of your own books, including award-winning books, won the Medical Network's 1997 book award, The Conscious Universe, which I devoured. It's all dog-eared and marked up. The Entangled Mind, and then the Silver Nautilus Book Award for Supernormal, which I just read, and Real Magic, which I read while I was on vacation in the Smoky Mountains. And there are others. I mean, we could go on. You've got over 440 peer-reviewed scientific publications on all this.
I think that's more like 140.
Yeah, what did I say?
I thought I heard 440, which should
No,
be...
no, no. Well, okay, 100. You've been busier than you realized.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, 140. You're right. 750 or more interviews like this, and presentations at Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Columbia, Cambridge, presentations at organizations like Merck, Google, even government institutions, the Naval War College, Army Special Operations Command, Naval Postgraduate School, and on. Films and television films and programs, over 40 of those. Just an extraordinary career. And I wanted to read the last part of your extended bio, because I thought it really interesting. You talk about having studied a psi phenomenon for most of your life. And you say, I've come to appreciate that psi experiences are not just weird anomalies. They're responsible for the greatest inventions, artistic and scientific achievements, creative insights, and religious epiphanies throughout history. Understanding this realm of human experience is thus more than an academic interest. It touches the very best that human intellect and spirit have to offer. So, very powerful statement to get us launched in. So thank you for a life of dedicated service and for taking the time to do this with me today. It's really, really a privilege.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, so maybe we just I have this being more of a conversation than an interview. We can just start in. But you might just start by, like, how would you describe this body of work that you've spent your life in, psi research? How would you define and describe that?
Well, first of all, we're talking about human experiences. It's where all psychological studies began, and it's the same in this domain. People report all kinds of interesting things. Some of them are somewhat mundane, like everyday experience, so nobody thinks twice about it, except maybe psychologists. But then there are stranger experiences, like the feeling of being stared at, which most people report, or what we can describe as telephone telepathy, where you hear the phone ring and you don't have a special ringtone and you just know instantly who it is and you haven't even looked at the phone. This is not surprising if you get a phone call every 20 minutes from your spouse or something. That's no big deal. But if you get the phone rings and you say, oh, you suddenly get a sense of, this is somebody I haven't talked to in 20 years. Why are they calling? Or maybe you just wake up that morning from a dream and you think of somebody you haven't thought of for 20 years, and then you get a letter or a phone call or a text or something. These kinds of experiences give us a kind of thrill, because you immediately wonder, how in the world did that happen?
Yeah.
So some people would call them synchronicities, a meaningful coincidence. There are other cases, in fact, all of these kinds of phenomena can be called that, whether it's a precognitive dream or a crisis telepathy moment where you feel that a loved one is in danger and it turns out that they are. There's tens of thousands of such experiences that have been documented. And we know from surveys that basically everyone at some point, well over 90% of people surveyed, have had one or more of these kinds of experiences. So the question then arises, well, is it just coincidence? Or did they make it up? Or how do we begin to understand these kinds of experiences, all of which suggest that there's a form of interconnection between people and events that transcend our usual ways of thinking about space and time. So what I just said 100 or 150 years ago would have been considered impossible, because space and time, matter and energy were all considered to be absolutes.
Right.
Now, as physics has advanced, we realize that space and time in particular are flexible and depend on the perspective of the individual. And we also know that the idea of connections that transcend space and time is a real physical phenomenon, mainly through quantum mechanics.
Yeah, it's fundamental actually to quantum mechanics. This interconnectedness, like the traditional model presumes separateness.
Right.
Material dead, separateness, no connection, no information exchange in vast empty space. Quantum mechanics completely reverses that and says, no, everything is, it presumes wholeness, it presumes connectedness and non-locality. So all of a sudden there's a substantial scientific new understanding that makes all this not just woo-woo.
Well, it's still a little woo-woo, because even within quantum mechanics, we don't exactly understand how this stuff can be. We know experimentally, we know from some theory that this is the way that the micro world is, and the macro world is made up of the micro world. So whether we can directly experience it or not, this holistic interconnectedness simply is the way that the physical world is stuck together. And so these phenomena, these psi phenomena, psi, by the way, is just the Greek letter P, which is the first letter in the word psyche, meaning everything to do with the mind. And so psi is used rather than the many syllables involved in psychic phenomena. Psi phenomena suggests that the types of interconnectedness that we know is true at the physical level is somehow also true at the experiential level. And so, again, the reason why there's still a lot of resistance within the scientific world about these phenomena is because, and this is beginning to change, by the way, but up until somewhat recently, it was thought that, yes, the micro world is quite strange and is different than our everyday world, but it doesn't scale up. And now we know that's not true. There are all kinds of things at the macro level, including in living systems, where quantum phenomena are beginning to be seen. And it's because we have new ways of looking. So the likelihood is that psi phenomena will probably not be described adequately by today's quantum mechanics. But today's quantum mechanics is not the end of physics either. It's, in some respects, the beginning of physics.
Yeah, like we've just scratched the surface of.
Right. So we will almost certainly find, as physics continues to advance deeper into the nature of reality, that the kinds of experiences that we have would be expected to occur based on what we know about the physical world. And by the way, the physical world concept is beginning to change too, because it used to say that consciousness, whatever that was, our own personal experience, had nothing to do with physics. That's changing very quickly too.
Yeah.
It does have something to do with physics.
Well, and also the physical world, if you take Einstein's statement, there is no matter. There's only energy at a frequency that's now perceptible to the senses. So when you get into the quantum world, the understanding of what we call physical, as Niels Bohr said, I think it was Niels Bohr said, what we think of as real is not made of what we think of as real.
Yeah, our understanding of matter has dramatically changed and is continuing to change. In fact, many physicists don't even think of it in terms of matter per se anymore. It's about relationships between things that have no names yet. A relational existence rather than little hard atoms and things of that sort.
Which is fundamental to this conversation. If it's a relational universe, well, what we're describing is relationships.
Yeah.
Information. Beautiful. So let's jump in, and I'll follow your lead. We could start wherever you want to, but one of the things that I'm playing with in terms of our application is the ability to be intuitively informed. You mentioned in that write-up that it's the source of some of creativity and some of the really innovative breakthroughs. In an earlier series, I interviewed Federico Fujin, who invented the microchip, and he's now a consciousness researcher, and he understands how those breakthroughs happen very differently now than when he had them. Mm-hmm. The same with David Wiebers, who's a neurologist and has made some very important medical breakthroughs that came in a flash, in an instant. So this ability to be informed intuitively is one aspect of it. And the other is to shape reality, that mind can actually shape reality to some extent. And so why don't we start with this notion of being informed or intuitively informed. And I'll follow your lead, but my thought was that might be a nice opening into remote viewing and some of the research there about being able to see things at a distance. And so if we could just start there, and you've done, I want to just get out here so we don't have to keep going over it. The research methodology here has been honed and honed and honed to be extremely rigorous, partly because it's come under so much scrutiny, the nature of this research. You've had to cover every base to make the research methodology bulletproof. So you might want to explain sort of a typical experiment here in this domain, and then what you're learning from it.
Well, you've asked 15 different entrees into this topic, so
Okay.
Maybe I'll work backwards.
Launch in.
So it is true that the methodologies that have been developed in order to study these kinds of experiences have been scrutinized and criticized for many, many decades, which has been very valuable because it means that any possible loophole, in order to do the next experiment, you figure out a way of closing that loophole. And that has been done again and again and again. It's not just me, by the way, it's all of my colleagues over the past 140 years. So in the process, what is not generally known is that methods that are taken for granted now and used in mainstream psychology and other disciplines, methods like the use of double-blind techniques to get rid of experimenter or subject bias, that was developed for telepathy experiments, as was the entire basis for the neurosciences, at least initially, the development of the EEG to measure brainwave activity. That was developed by a psychiatrist who had a psychic experience back in the 1930s and was determined to find what he called the psychic energy that had passed in an episode between him and his sister, who were very miles apart, but they had some kind of connection. So that was Hans Berger. Gustav Fechner is the developer of the academic discipline called psychophysics, which is looking at the physics of the sensory system. He was a mystic. He was a physicist too, but he was a mystic, and he developed psychophysics to provide a scientific way of studying his internal conviction that mind and matter were really not separate, because that's what his mystical experience was telling him. So you could find this again and again throughout science, that methods that have been absorbed into the mainstream started because somebody somewhere had a psychic experience and they needed to figure out a way of studying it. This goes all the way up to today to meta-analysis, which is a primary tool used throughout the life sciences and in many other sciences as a way of determining whether replication is taking place in empirical work. Of course, that replication is the currency of confidence that we have in science.
Yeah, in science.
That was first done by J.B. Ryan at Duke University, who was at the time using ESP cards to study telepathy and remote viewing or clairvoyance. So he was the first one to publish a meta-analysis. So that was a bit of a deflection there. But I'll go back then to your question about what else do these phenomena do other than give us little tidbits of synchronicities every so often? Well, the nature of the phenomena, all of the phenomena, suggests that there's some aspect of mind that transcends space and time. And so if you think of this in terms of intuition, somebody has, often today we'll say during a meditation or something, you'll have a download. You just get a huge amount of information and you pay attention to it, and sometimes it turns out to be real. Well, where did that information come from? Well, there's two ways of thinking about what intuition is. One is forgotten expertise. This is sort of the conventional way of thinking about it. So if you're a fireman and you're looking at a burning building and you're deciding in an instant to run in to save somebody or to stay out because it's about to collapse, you don't think about it. You don't have time to think about it, but you rely on lots of previous experience to tell you that it's okay to run in now or I should not run in. So that's forgotten expertise, and that we all have that. The other thing, though, is, did you get a glimpse of the actual future? Are you getting information from somebody else who knows more than you do at that time? So those I would consider to be more in the realm of psi phenomena, because it is not information that you had before that you forgot or that is unconscious, but you're getting it from somewhere else. Well, how can you do that? Well, all of these phenomena suggest that our minds are mostly sort of around here somewhere, but it's not only there. It's also spread out through the universe and through space and time. So we have access to that, and under certain circumstances, usually when we're pushed to because of some kind of crisis, or if we're not in an ordinary state of awareness, we're dreaming, we took a drug, we're meditating, whatever. In those conditions where we're not spending all of our attention on here and now, we have the capacity to also pay attention to there and then. And so some of the downloads that people talk about that turns into creative art and new inventions, new ideas in any realm, it's plausible, at least. We can't say in any given case, but it's plausible that it's because your mind is expanded out You're grabbing the kind of thing that you want, you pull it back in, and it arises and feels like an inspiration or a download.
Yeah. I have a lot of personal experience with that in writing books and having a long practice of meditation. Most of my new ideas come in a flash, and it's partly why I'm really intrigued by this topic and think it has a role to do with leadership, especially as we move into a future that's going to require massive reinvention.
Mm-hmm.
New ideas that, and new technologies and new ways of leading and governing and organizing society that we can't even comprehend right now. That's what it's going to take. And so this notion of being able to expand consciousness or expand into the reaches of consciousness and access what we need to know seems really vital right now.
It also suggests that an enlightened business of any type might consider taking 10 minutes out of every hour, especially involving intellectual type work. You'd have 10 minutes of every hour where people are required to daydream. Right? You can't be looking at your phone, you can't be doing your work. You're required to sit there and stare out the window for 10 minutes for a couple of reasons. One is that it helps integrate what you've been doing. It helps also withdraw your mind from all of that. But it's like a moment to pause, to allow your mind to expand. And that essentially is kind of what daydreaming is about. You're in your imaginative space. So for people doing any kind of creative work or even analytical work, whatever it happens to be, that would probably enhance the productivity and especially the creativity of people doing that work. So when you take the 10-minute daydreaming break, I don't know if you regiment that or you simply say that you are required at some point, a signal will go off, and now you need to daydream for 10 minutes. And of course, it's probably also important to teach exactly what that means. It doesn't mean to perseverate on something you need to do for work, or it's like really engaging and having a moment, a meditative moment, without even calling it meditation.
One of the things that stands out as a theme in your research, and maybe I'm ahead of myself here, but is that people, altered states, you get better results with altered states.
Yes.
And long-term meditators and people who can expand their state of awareness or get deeply relaxed states of awareness, you get remarkably better statistical performance in these various types of psi experiments.
Yeah, I would like the newer term of non-ordinary states, because altered has a slight connotation of there's something wrong with it. Yeah, it's a non-ordinary state. Not waking state, but a more concentrated or relaxed. Well, paradoxically, both at the same time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Effortless striving.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. So where would we start with a good example of this kind of research?
Well, so telepathy is a good example. And then we've done surveys, by the way, with both beginning and advanced meditators to ask what sort of spontaneous synchronicities and other psychic type experiences that they may have had as a result that they attribute to their practice. And something like 75% report increased synchronicities all across the board. So it is true that simply, even for beginners, just beginning to pay attention to what's going on inside your mind, you do realize that we're fully connected with everything all the time. Most of the time we're filtering it out. But as you become more used to expanding awareness, you realize that these interconnections really are going on all the time. So telepathy, whether it's telephone telepathy or feeling is being stared at, is probably related to something like this. All of these kinds of experiences. Generally, what parapsychology has done, the scientific study of these kinds of phenomena, is first proof-oriented. We want to see, is this what it appears to be? Is it coincidence? How do we begin to understand what's going on? So the proof-oriented method that was developed, that has been used for the past 4 to 5 decades in thousands of individual sessions and a couple of hundred experiments, each of which has about, on average, around 30 different sessions, is called the Ganzfeld telepathy method. So Ganzfeld is a German term meaning whole field. It was developed by Gestalt therapists in the 1930s, and it's a way of putting somebody quickly into a state which is kind of like sensory deprivation, except you're not deprived. It's rather an unpatterned stimulus. So you put a half of a ping pong ball over each eye, and so you keep your eyes open, and then you have a red light shining in your face. So everywhere you look, you just see kind of a pink color. And very rapidly, the brain gets used to that, and so after a while, you don't see anything at all, but your eyes are open, which is important because then you know you're not asleep. We don't want people to fall asleep. You wear headphones playing white noise, so you can't hear anything, and again, your brain gets starved for information after a while, and so you don't hear anything either. And so, and then you're relaxing in a comfy chair, and after a while you don't feel anything. So it's kind of sensory deprivation, except you're getting stimulus all the time, so you're not falling asleep. In that state, it is thought that you become more sensitive to subtle impressions, because you're constantly looking for something different. So you put somebody in that state for between 15 and 20 minutes to kind of get them to relax into that state. It's similar, as some people have described, to a hypnagogic state, the state that when you're beginning to wake up after sleeping and you're not quite there yet, but you're also awake. And meanwhile, you have selected, the experimenter will have selected 4 pictures that are different from each other as best as you can manage. One of them is selected at random, and an assistant takes that random one, and these are in envelopes, so nobody knows what it is yet. You give that to the person who will act in the role of the sender. So the sender will then take the envelope, they'll look at this picture. Their job is to take the next 20 minutes and mentally send the information about this picture to the receiver, who's in the Ganzfeld condition, who is isolated oftentimes by acoustic isolation and distance. In some experiments, you provide a one-way audio link from the receiver of information to the sender, so that anything that the sender is told to speak out loud, whatever your experience is, their words are carried to the person who is doing the mental sending, so the sender can adjust their sending strategy. And it makes it much easier for the sender in this experiment to be attentive to the task, because you can hear the receiver in your head, and you have this picture you're trying to send to them, and you're trying to adjust how you're sending it so that they get the content of that image.
Yeah, and the sender isn't speaking. The only one
No.
speaking might be the receiver. So the sender is trying to send it mentally.
Right. The sender is allowed to speak. They're allowed to jump up and down, scream, and do anything they want because they're isolated, rigorously isolated. So anything happening in their chamber, sometimes in a different building, it can, so that we want to make sure that there's no sensory leakage. I mean,
Right.
And the receiver oftentimes is in an electromagnetically shielded room, oftentimes acoustically shielded, sometimes even magnetically shielded, and at a distance. So we're making absolutely sure there's no conventional way that they can communicate.
And the distance doesn't matter. Like how far, it could be in another room, it could be in another country.
Right. There are fewer experiments that are very far distances for pragmatic reasons, but there have been some that have basically spanned the entire globe. So in the Ganzfeld experiment, at the end of the sender doing 20 minutes of sending, they stop that, and now an assistant who is with the receiver, who doesn't know what the target image is, they take them out of the Ganzfeld condition, they play back anything that the receiver said, because when you're in that kind of fuzzy state, it's hard to remember what you said. And now they show them 4 pictures, one of which was the actual thing being sent, and there are 3 decoys. So the 4 pictures are selected so they're as different from each other as you can manage, which is not so easy, but you do that. And so if telepathy was happening, the receiver would select the correct image more likely than the incorrect images, the decoys. And so by chance, you'd expect a 25% hit rate.
Because there's 4 pictures, so chance would be 1 in 4,
Right.
25%.
And so what you get now after about 120, I forget whether it's 120 or 140 experiments of this type, each one averaging roughly 30 sessions of this type, you get around 30 to 32% hit rate. So it's somewhere between 5 and 7% over chance expectation. When you evaluate the likelihood of that happening by chance, we're talking about trillions to 1 against chance. The odds are trillions to 1. So in other words, it is not a chance outcome that if you expect 25% after doing a few thousand trials of this type, that you're going to end up with 30 to 35, 32%.
Yeah, I just want to pause on that because trillion to 1 beyond chance. If it were chance, you end up roughly 25%. You're at 30, what'd you say, 32, about 7%
30 to
above
32%,
roughly?
depending on the study. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you do the analysis on that, the probability that that's a chance outcome due to randomness is trillions to 1.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So sometimes people say, yeah, but all these studies were done by believers, and so, what do we think about that? And maybe they're biased. So as it turns out, for many years there was no good response to that, because while I would say I'm a believer in the sense that I believe it might be possible, and so much so that I would be willing to run an experiment, but the experiment has to be done well, because otherwise you're wasting your time. So we jump through many hoops to make sure that the due diligence is correct, so that if we get a result, whatever it happens to be, we have confidence that it's a real result. So anyway, the secondary way of answering that is, well, what if you get people who really don't believe in this at all? They don't even want this to be true, but they nevertheless follow the protocol and do the experiment correctly. What do they get? Well, so in 2005, there were 2 professors at Notre Dame University who did this experiment and ended up with 32%, and very begrudgingly admitted in their article that they got the same result, in fact, a statistically significant result in their own studies, as had been reported in the meta-analysis of previous experiments. So it doesn't matter if you believe in this or not. If you follow the protocol of this type of experiment, you get results that everybody else has seen. So that's important, because that's the gold standard in science. Independent people, regardless of their belief, can get the same results. So the question then is, if that is true, and I believe that it is true, like I believe the data says somehow some sort of correlation is happening. It's not necessarily that information is being sent, being transmitted. What we see is literally a correlation. It looks like it's a causal connection because of the way that the protocol is set up, but we don't actually know that. In fact, very rarely do we actually know what the causation of something is. In some cases we do, but in this case we see a correlation. Okay, the minds are connected in some way. If that were true, then it is probably also true that if we were recording their brains at the same time with a slightly different protocol change, where you have a sender, you have a receiver, there's no images involved. You simply put the sender in front of a light that flashes, which would create a very predictable evoked response in that person's brain. If the 2 brains are connected in some way, then you should see the other brain jump too. Well, that kind of experiment has been done a few dozen times, and you get results that are not quite as good as you do, not as clear as you do in the Ganzfeld, but you do see correlations between brains that are isolated from each other at a distance. This has also been done in functional MRI, which is more interesting now, because you can not only see electrical correlations, you can see where in the brain the effect is showing up. So you put the receiver in the MRI, which, as you know, with MRIs, they're very heavily isolated from the rest of the world because they have to. You put the sender somewhere at a distance, and for the sender, what you present to them is either a flickering checkerboard image, black and white matrix kind of thing that flickers, or a static one. And the reason you use that stimulus is because you know And if you're looking at a flickering checkerboard-like pattern, it will create a lot of activity in the occipital lobe in your brain. So your back of your brain lights up. If you're looking at a static image, it doesn't do that because our brains and all our sensory systems respond to change. So, okay, what is happening in the brain of the receiver? And now these are two carefully selected people who have reported many times that they feel like they are mentally connected. You don't just choose people off the street for this. Choose people who seem to have some kind of connection. So where is the activity happening in the brain of the receiver? The answer is in their occipital lobe. You see a significant change. So this tells us that the correlations that we're seeing, both in content, like in the Gansfeld case, they're describing an image, or at least selecting an image, so there's content there, and in brain activity, in terms of where it's taking place, it is as though the two people are behaving as one. And in some respects, that's what a holistic environment is all about. We're not really that separate. At the right time and right place, and even in the laboratory, we can show that those connections are actually real.
Yeah, and as you mentioned that in terms of these, was it MRI studies, you're taking people who report being very connected and having phenomena where they experience that. But in a lot of the studies, like the Gansfeld studies and some of the remote viewing studies that you've done, you're really working with anybody and everybody, the average person. So it's not that it takes that it requires some special gifted talent, and there are people who are specially gifted, but a lot of these studies are done with normal folks like you and me.
Yeah, college sophomores who are doing an experiment because they get credit for their psychology. Went away for a minute to pick up this. It's a little box I'm making. This is part of an experiment that I'm running, and this is part of the enclosure. So I have a 3D printer that's going, which I'm watching over here through my video, and I saw that it had just finished.
And is that part of an experiment you're running?
It is. Let's see, I can show you, I'll show you one of the boards here. So this is what one of the boards looks like. And then it'll fit in here, like this. And then there's the top part of it that encloses the whole thing. So this goes into the computer. So what this is an optical interferometer, right? So there's a laser, there's a bunch of sensors down here that are looking at what the laser is doing. This is part of a long series of experiments which is trying to connect the phenomena that we're talking about with physics. And as you know, within physics, one of the things that makes quantum mechanics different than classical physics is that when you observe a quantum object, its behavior changes. This is one of the openings for why we think that consciousness and the physical world are connected in some intimate way.
Right.
So one way to look at that phenomena in the physics lab is through the double-slit optical system.
I was just reading about that today in your book, Supernormal. Yep. Fascinating.
And so this is an experiment which goes along those lines. Mm-hmm. And so many very prominent physicists have suggested that the consciousness is involved in the collapse of the quantum wave function. That's what we're doing here. So this is a new experiment I'm doing, which is a very simple but nevertheless effective and sensitive interferometer. And we get the interferometer effect because you're not looking at the system. So the experiment is very simple, and this has been doing this for like 10 years now, lots of experiments, to see what happens to an interference pattern when you're directing your attention towards it. Not looking at it with your eye, but simply with your mind's eye. Does the interference pattern change?
Of light, right?
Of light.
Interference
yes.
pattern of light.
Yeah. It would work with electrons or any other elementary particle, but yeah, this is with photons. So I've done this experiment many times, and as I said before, the currency of confidence in science is independent replication. And so I have colleagues who want to replicate this, but they don't have an interferometer. Like my psychology colleagues, they wouldn't know what to do. My physicist colleagues, they could do it. But then they don't understand the psychological side. So I'm making 50 of these devices that will then send out to both academics and to other people like long-term meditators who will participate in the experiment. And so they're each of them collecting a certain amount of data. It's all predefined. The data is automatically sent to me from wherever they happen to be over the internet. And I'll be able to then get a huge amount of data from lots of selected people, each of which is an independent person doing the experiment.
Right.
So that's what I'm working on now. I'm almost finished. I'm at the stage now where I simply need to print all of the enclosures, and that's why I have it going 10 hours a day, because it takes a long time to print these things.
That's great. Now, as long as we're in it, can you kind of define what you've discovered here that you're trying to replicate?
Well, the mystery is that if you have an optical interferometer, and the classic is the double slit, that if you gain information about where the photon is going in this device, and we're talking about slits that are 10 microns across, so it's thinner than the human hair, and you can't really see the slits too well. You can shine a light and it looks like one slit, but there's two tiny little slits. You shine a light through that, an individual photon, and it either will go through the left or the right. At least that's the way you think of it. If you think of light as a particle, it's a
Right.
thing. Right?
Yeah.
So it goes either through the left or through the right. If you don't know which of the two slits it is going through, you will get a pattern that looks as though it wasn't a particle after all. It was more like a wave.
You get on the
wave.
recording device, you get a wave pattern.
Right. You get an interference pattern of light and dark bands,
Right.
which is exactly what you'd expect if light were behaving like a wave.
Right.
But if you put a detector there, like a photodetector, where you can detect that it went through the left slit or you went through the right slit, then the wave structure goes away. And now you see what looks like two diffraction patterns, like two bullets going through.
Right.
And it's not exactly that all of the wave-like behavior goes away, because there's still diffraction, but it's a very dramatically different looking interference pattern. It's not
This
interference.
is one of the most famous experiments in physics, the double slit experiment, where we started to really learn that this dual nature of light.
Right. This is the thing when we refer to wave-like and particle-like nature of light.
Right.
It is both wave and a particle, but it depends on how you look at it. And this is not just true for light. It's true for any elementary particle. The way you look at it makes it behave in a different way. Some people say, and you still hear this today, that some people, physicists will say, the reason why it changes its behavior is because when you interact with a measuring device, it necessarily creates a change in it, like you've interacted with something, and that's what's causing this change. That's not true. It actually, it is true in the sense that, yes, if it interacts with an interferometer, but what really matters is the information that you can get. And so there's something called negative measurement experiments, which is the same kind of experiment. You have a detector behind one slit, but you have nothing behind the other slit. You shoot a single photon. And so if this detector doesn't go off, because this one's live and it's waiting, it doesn't go off, but the screen at the other side gets a dot on it, you know that it had to go through the other slit. So you have information even though it never touched the detector.
Never interacted with the detector.
It never interacted with anything.
Right.
All you know it must have gone through the other one because there it is.
Yeah.
So that's negative measurement. That information will cause a collapse of the wave function. You don't get interference anymore. It's a negative observation in the sense that you're inferring that you must have known how something happened, and that is information. And the information is correct because you actually do see a dot on the screen. That is enough to cause collapse of the wave function, and that means that we're really talking about what you can know, which is very strange, because now it really does say that there's aspects of the physical world that change depending on what you know about it, even if you're not making a measurement. So physicists have worried about this and say, well, what's going on then? How does anything happen? How does anything ever transition from a wave-like potential abstract state, as described by quantum mechanics, into the physical world as we experience it? So people like John von Neumann and actually most of the founders of quantum mechanics said it must have something to do with our awareness or our knowledge of what's happening in a measurement. That means something to do with consciousness. So one of the ideas then is that you can do a double slit experiment and simply ask somebody to use clairvoyance to gain knowledge of what's going on inside the interferometer. So they're not looking at it, they're using their mind's eye to get information out of a system. Well, if gaining information from a system causes it to behave differently, then that should change the interference pattern. That's the basic idea. So we've used double slit in double slit systems with continuous beam lasers and diode lasers and special lasers that are insensitive to temperature changes and frequency changes and all kinds of stuff. Even single photon systems. Some operated over the internet so that people could do it from 18,000 kilometers away, which is anywhere you are on the Earth, that's how far it is away to the other side of the world. So we've done that between our lab in California to South Africa, that's 18,000 kilometers. And then we're able to see, first of all, do we get anything that looks like not necessarily a collapse of the wave function, but a change, a detectable change in the wave function, and does it depend on distance? So yes, we get a change in the wave function. We see changes in interference patterns when people are attending to it versus when they're not attending, and distance doesn't matter. And it's only that distance and space doesn't matter. There's also an inkling of information suggesting that distance and time doesn't matter either. And that is both an experiment that we did, but it's also a mainstream experiment, like physics 101 mainstream experiment, the delayed choice experiment. So the delayed choice is that the photon goes through the double slit, and at that point you measure it, after it's already gone through. And so you're asking in that kind of experiment is that you do gain knowledge, but you gain knowledge after it already went through the double slits. Gaining that knowledge, even afterwards, will cause a collapse of the wave function. So this says that it's both knowledge in space, knowledge in time. It doesn't matter. If you gain knowledge at any time about what's going on with a physical measurement, it will change its behavior.
That was some of the most mind-boggling aspects of the research that you cited, was the relationship to time. That, and I'll let you take it further, but the premonition experiments, where you're getting an effect before it happens. People's physiology would change before the image was shown to them. Some of those experiments, and other ones that had to look like you were actually affecting something in the future that happened in the past. And when I was reading it, I was going back to I think it's Max Planck who said, if quantum mechanics hasn't shocked you yet, you don't understand it.
Yeah, and it could have been Planck, it might have been Bohr. I think it was Niels Bohr who said that.
Yeah. Yeah,
if you're not shocked by this, you don't understand it. And it's true that the space separation we're sort of comfortable with because we have cell phones, and so it's not a big deal. Time separation is much more difficult to imagine, and yet it's in the equations of physics, and you can see it in experiments as well. There's something very peculiar about the passage of time, which from a physics perspective, there's good reason to believe that there is no passage of time. And even in our own experience, we know that all we ever experience is now. We can prepare for the future and we can think about the past, but all there is now. Of course, which is said throughout all of the esoteric traditions as well. Right. It's all about now.
Right. And if there was no memory, there'd be no time.
There would also be no depression. It is said that depression is perseverating on the past, and anxiety is perseverating on the future. So if you can stay in the present, No depression, no anxiety. It's not that easy, but yeah.
So we've established telepathy at trillion to one odds.
Yeah. And in electrocortical activity and even in deeper brain activity.
Right.
And then another class looking at the autonomic nervous system. So in all of these cases where we're looking at connections between people, whether it changes in heart rate or skin conductance or other autonomic faculties or central nervous system or even experience, as in the Gansfeld case, we do see these connections under very controlled conditions in the laboratory. As you were saying, you see it even in college freshmen or college sophomores who may not have any interest in this. You see it to a stronger extent in people who are family members and others who are tightly emotionally connected.
One of the things that caught my attention in the research started with this experiment in being stared at, the effect of being stared at, where they would put, if I understand it, somebody in a room wired up to the kinds of devices you just described that could measure galvanic skin response, blood pressure, heart rate, breathing, all that, sort of like a lie detector. And someone else in a separate room, isolated in the way you've talked about it, that would randomly be told to stare at this person. And there was a screen, they could see him on a screen, and they would stare at them. And then you were measuring, was there actually a physical response in the person being stared at when this person was staring at them? And you got a correlation. And what really got my attention then was when you started, as I remember, it was help them get connected beforehand, establish a relationship, and then you'd get the same result. Yes, there was a physiological effect, but it was a more relaxing effect. It brought more coherence. So one of the statements was that the person of greater coherence always brought greater coherence into the other. You could literally bring more coherence, help me move from maybe more of an anxiety state into a more relaxed, coherent state, just by your presence at a distance.
Yes, for people who associate that feeling with being calm. But not, well, if you have two people who are doing a dyad meditation, for example, and they associate that experience, that connectedness with being calm, then yes, that's what you'll see even in a remote state. But if it's with a stranger, or the people like cops and robbers staring at each other, that becomes an arousing response, and you see that physiologically too. So the receiving party in this, and I mean, it's the language here makes it sound like there's a separation, but it's the only way we can talk about it. The person who is receiving the staring, they will respond appropriately for how they regard that kind of connection. So they don't want to be stared at, then they're going to have a sympathetic arousal effect. If they enjoy that because the person staring at them is their loved one, for example, then they're going to have a parasympathetic response. And you see that appropriately in their body.
At a distance, separate rooms. They don't know when they're being stared at, but there's a physiological response.
Right. And what's even more interesting is we're talking here, the physiological response we're talking about is a deep unconscious response. Very rarely will the receiving party say, I felt it. Sometimes they do, but not often. So what also works is that if the person who is the receiving party is involved in an attention task, like they're looking at a candle flame, they're told, pay very close attention to this candle. Anytime your mind wanders, just bring it back and pay attention. Every time you notice that your attention has wandered, press a button. So you're monitoring how close their attention is on this task. Meanwhile, at a distance, every so often, closed-circuit television is showing what's going on inside the box. The sender is asked to distract their attention, to pull their attention away from the task. And so the hypothesis is that when they're being distracted at a distance, they actually will mind wander a lot more. And then there's a reverse task. Help
If I'm the
this person.
sender and you're the receiver, you're trying to focus, and I'm trying to distract you.
Right. Or you're doing the opposite and you're helping me pay attention.
Okay.
Right. So there's the two different directions. Does that work? The answer is yes. And so that essentially is the Jedi mind trick. Right? These are not the droids you're interested in. You can distract, or you could also help in that direction. So we're talking here not so much about physiology at this point, although that is also happening. We're talking about a higher level behavioral response having to do with attention. Mm-hmm. So again, it's as though the state that the sender is in, either excited, relaxed, attending, whatever, can be almost cast upon or reflected within the other person.
So I want to just step back and talk about why I'm so fascinated by this as a leader of a business that works with coaches and consultants and leaders around deep development, psychological development, inner work that transforms how they show up in the world. We've talked about the capacity for of sending thoughts, influencing sending thoughts. We've talked about state. This was it Gansfield? Is that how it's?
Gansfeld, yeah.
Gansfield, and other kinds of state, like meditation practice and so on, enhances the capacity to receive information and or send information. And so as a coach, we're talking about a meta capacity to manage my presence and state with you such that you arise in me, or I have subtle access to information in the way that we're talking about, in a way that can serve you. I find myself noticing things or saying things that I'm not sure why I'm saying them, and they land in a way that is very, very powerful. Mm-hmm. And so everything I read about from the research that you've done suggests that this kind of telepathy, this ability to both influence and access, is enhanced by state, and that the kind of information I may be picking up on in you is a real phenomenon. Yeah. I won't get into the particulars, but I was recently working with a leader, and we were both at the bottom of a deep, deep fear. And we both knew that awareness hadn't come and it hadn't shifted yet. It was, yes, I see it, I get the whole story, I see how I'm making it up, but I don't know how to shift. I don't feel it shifted. And I said, well, let's just connect and just sit together with that. And in that connection, some words came, and I just spoke them. And the person went, that changes everything.
Wow.
You could literally see the physiological, like, complete opening. Oh, that changes everything. And it felt for me like I had no idea where those words came or whether they would resonate. And it landed. And so I'm watching more and more this capacity. I'm with someone and I say, boy, when you talked about that, your whole field just lit up. I just felt this expansion happen. I don't know what that means. Does that mean anything to you? And they're like, oh, and then that opens up a whole conversation. So this ability to use what you're talking about in practical ways, in deep connection or resonant coherence with another person, you have access to information and you can speak into it in a way that helps what's trying to happen to unfold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Every psychotherapist that I've spoken to has many, many examples like that.
Yeah. And that's intuition happening in the moment. The very thing we're talking about happening in the moment as a practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you were mentioning when we first began talking about what are the applications to these kinds of experiences. So we talked about creativity a little bit. You're talking about what amounts to penetrating through somebody else's unconscious barriers, because the barriers are for them. It's not for you. You don't. I mean, it doesn't matter for you what those barriers are. But we're able to, but at different levels of connection, you can see right through it. And that's actually one of the fears that people have when if somebody says they're psychic. The fear is they could see right through me, right? They're no blocking at all. Well, it could be a fear, or depending on the context, it could be great, right? That's what you'd want for a doctor who's doing a diagnosis, for example. Yeah, to see completely. Yeah, and if there's anything that modern psychology has learned, and the neurosciences as well, we're saturated with all kinds of biases and filters. And in a sense, as organisms, we need to have all of them, because we couldn't do anything. We'd be overwhelmed with too much information if we were constantly paying attention to everything. But we get used to it after a while, too. And so the filters become more and more solid and prevent us from seeing what is. So a good therapist or a good coach can see through that. And as you said, sometimes it's just pointing something out which changes everything.
The same is true with leaders. You're in a complex meeting, lots happening. Your ability to pick up on the subtle information that's in the field of the room, and know what to do, know what to say, speak into it in a way that changes the conversation. It's the same practice, now collective. We have this fun saying that leaders bring the weather. When you walk in the room, everybody reads the weather. Is it a stormy day or is it a clear day? Can we really have this conversation, or do we need to be careful about what we're going to say? And so they're reading your body language, but they're also, I think, reading the resonance, the field that's in the room. And you've got experiments about group fields that with random number generators and so on, that actually, you might want to get into some of that, the ability of an individual to affect a random number generator just with their intention, but also as a group becomes coherent or galvanized around a powerful focus, you see measurement changes in the consciousness field.
Yeah. So this, again, all of these kinds of studies start with experiences that people report. So this experience comes from people in sports teams or choruses or meditations, wherever there's a group doing something together, that occasionally the behavior of the group and the mental state of the group kind of gels. So they call the group, will call it, as getting into the zone.
Right.
And so we
Together.
probably, yeah, it's like it's one organism at this point. And you see this occasionally, probably most often in something like a team sport where people need to pass a ball or they need to do something with each other and they're not even looking, and it's just like flowing, and the people engaged in that activity are well aware of it. Like it feels magical. So I've played a lot in orchestras and chamber groups and so on, and occasionally you'd feel it there too. Like we are playing way beyond our individual capacity right now. And it's pleasurable. It's amazing to be inside that. So the question then is, and well, of course, the audience or the people watching this also kind of feel it. They can feel something different has happened. So the question is, well, what is that? What makes a difference? And of course, coaches of teams desperately want that to happen, and they work at making it happen. It's not always so easy. So we said, okay, let's assume that this is a real field phenomenon of some type. It's not simply a psychological thing going on, but there's something that actually causing the gelling to happen. So the way then to see if this field is a thing, is it really a thing? Like it feels physical, but is it really? For 50 years, we've been using physical devices to detect if there's some kind of a consciousness interaction, a mind-matter interaction. These devices are ultimately quantum in the sense that we're using a random event, typically using something like a Zener diode. And so inside the Zener diode, the diode is an electrical component that allows current to flow in one direction but not the other one. The reason why that happens is because there's an energy barrier in the semiconductor itself. So an electron gets up to this barrier, doesn't have enough energy to go over it in that direction, and so the current doesn't flow. But it does have enough energy to go in this direction because of the design. So it turns out that you can use those devices to bias it backwards. You electrically bias it so that occasionally you have an electron getting to the forbidden energy zone, it'll go right through it. And so that can't happen classically because it doesn't have enough energy. But it can happen from a quantum perspective because a particle can also be a wave. So the wave can get through things because the wave is not exactly physical. And we know that, I mean, it sounds crazy, but that's the way it is. The question is, when does the electron get to do that? And that is considered to be fundamentally random. Like nobody knows, nothing can predict when that's going to happen. So we take this very elementary thing happening in the circuit, and we can turn those random times into bits, zeros and ones. So the one is sort of that, yes, it made it through the energy barrier, and the zero is, no, it didn't. It's not quite that, but it's pretty close. So it's like an electronic coin flipper, essentially, ultimately traced down to a quantum effect. So the question then is, well, if you tell people while they're looking at the graph that's being drawn by these little bits, can you make more one bits come out? Just mentally will that to happen. Can you help it somehow? Or can you make more zero bits come out? So that has been done for 50 years in the laboratory. We know that that works. So stepping away from the guts of the experiment, it means that we have the capacity to change probabilistic events through our will.
Right, and the odds beyond chance when you do the meta studies on that are phenomenal. I mean, they're
It's a gazillion to one.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
replicated many, many times.
Yeah,
These,
exactly.
by the way, these are all of the things I've been mentioning are small effects. They're usually tiny, tiny little effects. But because you can do it repeatedly in the laboratory, you can gain more and more confidence that the effects are not chance. Right? Even the Ganzfeld state, the effect is over 25%. It's about 5% more than that. So somebody can say, well, why is everybody jumping up and down over a 5% effect? It doesn't sound very big. It's because we've done it so many times that we know that that 5% is really 5%. It's
Yep.
not,
And
it
it's
wasn't zero.
Yep.
So the same is true then with the use of random number generators. Really tiny effects, but they're real effects. So my colleague Roger Nelson, who was at Princeton at the time, got this idea, well, let's take the random number generator and bring it into a theatrical performance or a movie or a sports team or something where people seem to get mentally coherent. Will that somehow be reflected in the randomness? Because now there's a whole bunch of minds that are coherent, and it turns out that the answer is yes. That somehow mental coherence in groups, I don't want to say cause, correlates with a rising of coherence in these random number generators.
So coherence would mean it moves off random and becomes either more ones or more zeros.
More orderly.
More orderly.
Yes. So the easy way of thinking of it is more ones or more zeros. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that, but that's close enough. Because once you have a random system, there's a gazillion different directions you can go to demonstrate that it's no longer random. Patterns appear. So from that, Roger used to go to individual groups with a random generator, do this, and then so I got into the act two and I started doing it. And then it occurred to us that it would be really interesting to do this for world events, large scale events, because then we're no longer dealing with groups. We're talking about millions to potentially billions of people all engaged in the same thing at the same time because of the way that media now carries things live around the world. So Roger and I and a bunch of our buddies got together and we created something called the Global Consciousness Project, in which we put random number generators that were running 24/7 in a bunch of cities around the world. All the data was uploaded to a server at Princeton. We ran this experiment for 20 years, and the formal experiment involved 500 events, each of which was inferred to attract millions of people, if not more. So one example was like 9/11. So 9/11, once the event occurred, over the next, actually over a very long time, but over the next couple of days, hundreds of millions of people were just wrapped with attention to that one event. And there are other events kind of like that, usually not quite as big, but big events. Like World Cup soccer would attract 1 billion people watching the same event. So at the peak, we had 70 random number generators going, all going simultaneously, all streaming their data up. And our hypothesis was that during these large-scale events where people did not know that they were involved in an experiment, they were just becoming coherent, what was happening to randomness, physical randomness at that time? And the short answer is it changed in a dramatically demonstrable way, so that the odds against chance after the 500 formal events was 3 trillion to 1. So if you do the calculations on this, you can say, well, it could have been chance, but we would need to have run this experiment for 20 years, 3 trillion times, in order to be able to see the result that we did, which is much, much longer than the length of the universe. So we're pretty sure that something really big happened. There's mental coherence arising at certain times, and then the physical world was not quite as random during those times. So we're now deep into creating what we call GCP 2.0, the next generation of this, because the first one ran from 1998 up to a few years ago, still kind of running, but it's smaller. The new one will have, and as I said, at the peak, GCP1 had 70 random number generators. The new version, which is now being developed, will have 1,000 random generators. Each generator will have 4 separate streams. So we'll actually have the equivalent of 4,000 random number generators out there. The reason that the higher density is important is because one of the questions that would arise in GCP1 was, well, can you tell where something happened? Something started in New York City. Is it more patterned or something in New York City and it kind of ripples out for the rest of the world? Or does the whole world feel it at once? And we couldn't easily answer that question because we only had 70 and it wasn't a high enough density to know. With 4,000 around the world, we'll have a high enough density to do a topological analysis. Or if you're doing like a brain thing, you could do source analysis, find out where's the thing coming from. We'll be able to answer that question now.
Wow. That's going to be really interesting.
Yeah. We have evidence from GCP1 that even if something happened in a particular location, that all of the other generators respond, but they respond more where the thing is happening. Yeah.
So there is a non-local response, but there's a more powerful local response.
Yes, exactly.
Right, amazing.
Yeah, so this is the kind of fun that we have in thinking about what is the nature of these phenomena, how can we advance our knowledge about it, what do we need to do? Additional replications, more clever designs, and to a large extent, I think also it's about revisioning our worldview, because in order to understand these things, we can't stick with a purely materialistic worldview, which is where science has lived for a long time. It needs to become more comprehensive than that. And when you start moving away from a purely materialistic way of thinking about the nature of reality, then all of this stuff, which sort of breaks your brain a little bit thinking about it, it all becomes much, much easier to think about.
Well, and for me, the intriguing application here is kind of the meta capacity that a leadership team could develop to create a level of group field and coherence where they're tapped into something larger. And we have consulting firms that we work with that are actively working this with great success, where they can reliably get breakthroughs in a group that's really stuck on a vexing problem. They orchestrate the level of conversation and group coherence to a point where they step and walk into the unknown together, and at a certain point something new emerges that nobody had when they walked in the room, that surprises them and significantly informs their business strategy or vision or innovation that they're working toward, or something like that. And so and we all know what that feels like when we're in an orchestra, as you said, and it's like we're playing beyond ourselves here, or we're in a room and like the room sets up and you can feel that field effect in the room. And that's very generative in terms of creativity or truth-telling or psychological safety or everything that's required to have real breakthroughs. And so, and then if you couple that with what you were saying, that state management, or the ability to access an expanded state of awareness, enhances these effects, well, then how do we sit together in dialogue at state in a way that predisposes us to a breakthrough?
Yeah.
And it's a similar application to the coaching application we were talking about, where consulting, where I have subtle access to information that can be used to serve your development. And then the other thing that I'm intrigued by, which is why I really enjoyed the telekinetic aspect of it, the ability of mind to influence a random number generator or have a physiological effect on another person through my attention and intention. I don't know if you're familiar with Joe Dispenza's work. Well, I attended his marathon 7-day session, which was mostly spent in intensive energetic meditation practice that built and built and built and built. And they have random number generators in the room, and they get more ordered responses from the random number generator when the group is in one of these intensive meditations. But they're also working with University of California, San Diego, to do research pre and post these things on blood work, DNA, stool samples. And I've talked with the researcher after the session. He was beamed in by Zoom a couple times during the week. Blew me away. They're finding beyond clinical trial kinds of results that blow them away. They're the skeptics that you've had to deal with your whole life. And they go, we can't deny the data here. We see movements, they're measuring 3,000 blood metabolites, and they see massive movement across the board toward health in 7 days because of whatever is going on in this session. They're doing what they call coherence healings, which is having a group of people intentionally try to influence someone toward health, and they see drops in blood markers for cancer and so on. And they're shocked both by the magnitude of the effect and the degree that it's happening in the population. In other words, it's an 80% effect, not a 20% effect of the population. So our ability to, with our intention at state, shape our future, I think there's relevance there.
Well, and influence others whether they know it or not.
For better or ill,
Yes.
which you spoke about in Magic, your book, Real Magic.
Yeah. No, it's true that the moment you start entertaining a different worldview where things really are interconnected and people influencing other people. So if you have, I mean, one of the consequences is that if you have people suffering on the other side of the world, we block that because you get compassion fatigue after a while, but it still affects you. And so what we're seeing is the age-old guidance that the Golden Rule. It's really real, not just a nice thing to think about, but if somebody's suffering somewhere else, you kind of have to do something about it unless you're comfortable with feeling suffering too. It's just that it's difficult to do that because we, as an individual, it's not so clear what to do in many cases. But it becomes a consequence of, imagine an advanced civilization several thousand years ahead of us that have a different worldview that has developed as a result maybe of science, where we recognize that the health of the entire world depends on the health of each individual, what they think. So, I mean, that can go, there's the science fiction stories here which go in either direction. If you want that to occur in an entire world, you can enforce it, kind of, or you can encourage it to kind of unfold on its own and in a natural way. Well, the latter method would probably be a lot better.
Yeah.
Although, I don't know. I don't know how you can enforce such a thing, but if you were to get people in alignment in such a way so that promoting the best outcome for each person in the most healthy state and the cleanest mind, and all of that stuff, that would help everyone very quickly. It would probably also heal the planet. I mean, even ecologically, it would heal it faster than we would be able to imagine.
Yeah. What you're suggesting is that these metacapacities are latent in most of us, that they're real.
By virtue of being sentient creatures, yes.
Yes. Not because one person is special and the other isn't.
Right. Even though there are people who are talented in this domain, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've met some of those people and they blow you away with
Yeah.
what they can see and have access to.
But the way that I see it is it's not all that different than meeting somebody who's an Olympic athlete,
Right.
right? Or a marathon runner. If you know, I could run probably 20, 30 feet if I have to. But I mean, a marathon runner's not a normal person. Some people are genetically predisposed to be exceptionally good in things psychic.
And you begin to wonder whether someone like Einstein, that wasn't the genesis of his genius, really, because he talked about the intellect having little to do on the road to discovery, and
Yeah.
or a Ramanujan, a famous mathematician who, without really very sophisticated mathematical education, was writing very, very...
No, but he cheated because the goddess was telling him the answer.
Well, that's how he described it, right?
Yeah.
I get it when I pray,
Right.
which is code for state.
Yeah. Yeah. He went into some Gnostic condition or some noetic condition, and yeah, you can pull down the universe.
Yeah. And so that for me is the application, as we need to reinvent on every front. We need to reinvent our relationship with energy, our relationship with the ecosystem of the planet, with governance of the planet, with monetary systems, economic justice. Every aspect of society needs a major upgrade, none of which we know how to do, but the answers are available.
I think there are things that we know how to do. So some of it is information, as you're saying. We need ideas that are implementable in a way, given where we're starting, little baby steps. And there are a lot of people working on those kinds of things. Some of it has to do with the overcoming our vices, right? So the greed is probably bad vice number one. Power and greed and all of that is all wrapped together in such a way that can end up making us go extinct if we're not careful. Yeah. Well, the more and more people who start thinking about such things, I think the better off we are. We get into a coherence there as well. And it's easy to become discouraged about it because, I've been following climate science, for example, since the 1970s, and they kept saying, we got to do something, we got to do something. The bell keeps getting louder and louder, and a lot of them just gave up after a while because it's so hard to counter the status quo that there's like nothing they could do anymore. Well,
Yeah.
That's not good.
You've had to do that in your own domain. When I read your books, I get the sense that you've paid a price for the research you've done because it confronts the mainstream paradigm.
Yeah, there's a certain resistance to it, and I think if I cared a lot about what other people think, or if I had selected a profession where it was very important that you kowtow to the status quo, then I would not do this. I could not do this.
Yeah,
But I have enough of an iconoclast in me and a contrarian that I recognize the resistance, and a big part of me says, I don't care what you think.
yeah,
If I cared a lot, I wouldn't do this. And I completely understand why a lot of people don't want to get involved with it, even though they are personally interested, because they fully recognize that it would be irresponsible if they did. Right? If you're supporting a family and you don't want to lose your job, some things you can talk about and some things you can't.
yeah.
Well, I decided that my path, whatever that means, was to charge down this road. And that was the most important thing. And yeah, there's a price to pay.
Well, I want to honor that in you. You've made a huge contribution along with others, but you've certainly done a very powerful job of summarizing and integrating and taking the research further and being a part of what I think is seminal work that helps us reimagine our human possibilities.
Yeah.
And so I'm grateful to you and your work and the courage it's taken to stay in it, even though you're getting a lot of tomatoes thrown your way.
Yeah, so I don't. I've heard this a lot, and I appreciate what you're saying and about courage. I don't feel I'm that courageous. I am not somebody who's going to do free climbing up a mountain, and I'm very cautious when I'm walking around in a city. I'm not a brave person, except maybe from an intellectual perspective.
Yeah,
Right.
well, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so there I can be as brave as anybody.
Well, I appreciate you for doing that. And thank you for this conversation. It's been really remarkable.
It's my pleasure.